Welcome to Reading D&D Aloud with Ben Riggs and Dr. Scott M. Bruner. With special guest, Dr. Thomas M. Malaby. Episode 21, What Makes a Game a Game?
D&D, as its aficionados call it, is on one level the most free-form game imaginable, since the characters are allowed to do absolutely anything within the confines of the world created by the Dungeon Master, with his books, maps, and tables and preset towns, castles, dungeons, wilderness. Ellipsis. However, in another sense, D&D represents the ultimate bureaucratization of anti-bureaucratic fantasy. There are catalogs for everything, types of monsters, human abilities, lists of spells, types of statistics. All important qualities can be reduced to number. The numbers are, in a sense, a platform for crazy feats of the imagination, themselves a kind of poetic technology. Still, the introduction of numbers, the standardization of types of character, ability, monster, treasure, spell, the concept of ability scores and hit points had profound effects when one moved from the world of 6, 8, 12, and 20-sided dice to one of digital interfaces. Computer games could turn fantasy into an almost entirely bureaucratic procedure, accumulation of points, the raising of levels, and so on. These games ultimately reinforce the sense that we live in a universe where accounting procedures define the very fabric of reality, where even the most absolute negation of the administered world we're currently trapped in can only end up being yet another version of the exact same thing. So writes David Graeber from the Utopia of Rules on pages 188 and 189, our selection of discussion for today's episode.
And that was a reading by the one, the only, the indomitable, the unconquerable, the unstoppable, Dr. Scott Bruner.
Good evening.
And with us today is a man whom Dr. Bruner is going to introduce more fulsomely, but it is Professor Thomas Malaby.
It is, and we're actually honored to have him on. So Professor Malaby, who's going to be talking today, is the chair of the anthropology department at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. I had the pleasure of obviously having him on my dissertation committee, and also currently running a Curse of Strahd game. So Professor Malaby's curriculum vitae in this field is rather extensive and rather transcendent, I might actually add. He's written 2 books that deal with contingency, which means kind of random probability, things that could go in another direction, including Gambling Life, dealing with contingency in a Greek city. He also wrote Making Virtual Worlds, Linden Lab, and Second Life. One of the things that's interesting about Professor Malaby is his interests in contingency and probability in games and play also touch a lot on the digital realms as well. He's very famous for an article that he wrote called Beyond Play, where he tried to explain the difference. Well, he actually tried to complicate the differences, I would say, between play and games, and about thinking about playing games more as social practices rather than material artifacts. I hope I'm saying that right, Professor Malaby. And he's also fantastic, a transcendent cocktail maker, which is a bit of an aside. But before we get into it, he also, again, and I know that Ben, you'll probably post some of the links. I think folks out there will be really, really interested in potentially reading the Beyond Play article he wrote, because it is really interesting how it sets up to kind of a definition of games, which takes into account exactly what they can do and how important they really are to our experiences in life, what they mean for the folks that are interested in games and play. But Professor Malaby, I know you have an event coming up soon that I think probably a lot of our listeners would be interested in hearing a little more about.
That's right. Thank you, Scott. That was a very generous introduction. So on September 9th of this year, I will be giving a presentation for the Royal Anthropological Institute. That's our oldest professional organization in anthropology. And it is to kick off a series that they're doing on the anthropology of games and play. So that's a 2-hour virtual presentation. There is an event on the Royal Anthropological Institute website with a link to register, and that will be, I'll provide that to you folks after we're done here.
Fantastic. And let's get into talking. So this is the first time that I'd actually heard about this book. But when you posted and shared that this is what you wanted to say, I'm going to try to stop myself because I have so much to say about this text, because it so much deals with some of my work. This concept of like, not only does it have to do so much. Look, I said I wasn't going to talk, and here I am. It so aligns with a lot of the ideas and concepts that I've talked about in my dissertation, but it also has so much, the Venn diagram of what Ben and I talk about all the time, because our actually the regular show or the regular programming, we literally read the 1979 Advanced Dungeon Master's Guide word for word. And if there's no better way, I suppose, to put it than the way that David Graeber explains it, which is basically the bureaucratization of a world, the constant that we can take everything around us, or we can take everything around us in a fantasy book and turn it into a bunch of spiraling numbers like the Matrix. But so the first question to you is, why did you choose this text? What does it mean to you?
So I chose this text because I guess I've been thinking about it quite a bit lately. My most recent piece is a chapter in a volume, the Routledge Companion to Media Anthropology, and it's called The Digitally Natural. So what I'm interested in is that moment in this passage where David Graeber talks about the transition from playing tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons, and I can see my copy of the 1979 Dungeon Master's Guide right over there on the shelf. The transition from playing that game with those dice, it's a bit curious he doesn't mention the D4. I'll forgive the D10. But from playing the game with those dice, which I played back in the 70s, to computers, right? Which we don't necessarily want to spend a lot of time talking about tonight, depending upon what you want to do.
No, this is, I mean, are you aware of the current hot topics about where D&D is going?
I'm certainly aware of the upcoming 2024 September, new editions. I've been following the YouTubers on that quite closely. I was looking at the play testing and all that.
Have you heard anything about the kind of alarmism and fears about it becoming a digital subscription-based product, or no?
Right. Well, I heard, I think it was just today, that D&D Beyond will be kind of flipping over to that rule set at a certain point, right? So there's a lot there, right? And this passage caught my attention because he says something changes when we switch from these let's call them explicit, or vulgar would actually be an appropriate word in the original sense, right? Of the people, kind of the local kind of crude maybe mechanism that we might have for generating stochastic contingencies. Something changes when we flip from that to using something in the architecture behind the scenes to roll the dice for you, right? So the piece that I wrote is about how we take the digital infrastructures that surround us to be natural. Why do we take them to be natural? Well, a lot of that, I suggest, is because we are participating, like we participate in a game. We are participating performatively in making those worlds happen. But instead of seeing them artificially produced with a bunch of explicit algorithms running before our eyes, those algorithms are running in the background, and that makes it much more like everyday life, where things are implicit in the infrastructures around us, right? We take the street system outside our door as a given, as a natural thing, not a contrivance, not something designed, right? So when, with the benefit of code, institutions are able to incorporate the contrivance of those indeterminacies, those contingencies, into the landscape in which we live, online especially, not just online, then I think that changes in important ways the claims institutions make about what we should take to be natural and unquestionable and beyond what we would necessarily challenge. So that's how I got interested in this passage. It was actually passed to me by one of my PhD students, Matthew Carricker, who's currently doing his research in Norway, wonderful student. He sent a picture of these two pages to me, and I was immediately interested. Obviously, David Graeber is for anthropologists, he's a huge thinker he passed away just a few years ago, but a huge thinker on everything, essentially capacious thinker, as you can tell from the passage. But I didn't know that he'd ever written about D&D or had any familiarity with it until Matthew sent me that page, and that just made my head kind of explode, and I got very excited about it.
All right, Dr. Malaby, I'm going to ask you a really tough question. So we have 12-year-olds that listen to this.
Okay.
How would you summarize those points for an audience of 12-year-olds?
Oh, yeah, sure. So we all know that games are uncertain. The outcomes are uncertain, right? That's what makes them games when you stop to think about it, right? Like when an outcome happens with a game, but it turns out you suspect somebody cheated, right? Or the fix was in, somebody bribed an umpire or a referee, then it's all invalid, right? It's unhappy in an important way, right? And that idea about games being legitimately, that is, we take it to be properly uncertain, is very important to our understanding of what makes a game a game. It's what makes the meanings that it generates legitimate for us. We take them to be trustworthy and real and significant. So how we handle it when we're talking about games themselves, how that those different kinds of uncertainties, those different kinds of unpredictabilities are handled is very important for thinking about what makes good games different from bad games, for example. I mean, there are, after all, different kinds of unpredictability in games. There are the spinners and the dice and the shuffled decks of cards, right? But there are also the uncertainties of the players, in a game like basketball. Are you going to make the shot or not? That's not the same thing as spinning a spinner or rolling a die. When you're playing poker, are you going to make the right guess about what somebody else has, what they're holding? It's not the same thing as either of the other two, right? And so games are interestingly combine those things along with a set of constraints, which are important to remember, right? There are the rules, but people tend to make too much of the rules because there are other constraints. There are the conventions, the cultural conventions, the way we all know how we're supposed to play this game, and people don't act outside the boundaries of that. That's also a constraint on our behavior. And there are the architectures themselves, which really interest me. In Major League Baseball stadiums, many of your listeners might have gone to any baseball stadium. Minor leagues are the best baseball to go and see. Minor league baseball, Major League Baseball, any baseball stadium, you might see differences in how the outfield is set up or how the foul territory is set up. Those aren't rules. Those are architectures that lead to a big foul territory in Met Stadium or a small foul territory somewhere else, right? Short left field.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so that's how I would explain what's at stake here for your listeners, is that game design depends very heavily on calibrating those different kinds of uncertainties and constraints to make a game that is compelling to play. And when they're balanced properly, especially as against our performance, our ability to make a shot or make the right decision, we want to keep going, right? Well, today's institutions are getting better and better at making that want to keep going game architecture principle a part of the social media we take in every day, right? A part of the media landscape generally, unlike ever before. And that's the stuff I tend to write about. So that stood out to me here from this piece.
That was amazing.
I've said I'm chomping or champing at the bit. I
went one. I did one. Why don't you do one?
Yeah, really quickly.
I'm taking notes so I can always come back.
Well, there's so much to say in that. It's funny because, one of the things I've had the pleasure of having Professor Malaby, not only on my committee, but taking classes as well. And it's always interesting, your interest in the institutions. And I think, we're in many ways, it's interesting to me to talk about media environments as I love, of course, that I love baseball as well. Some of our listeners and I go back and forth and talk about different baseball things, but I love the concept of the concept of thinking about how a baseball, how outfield walls, or even the size of a foul area in a park is designed, in some ways for specific hitters. Of course, you want to think about, Yankee Field, and how far those things were specifically designed for left field hitters to knock it over.
Left-handed hitters from the short right porch in Yankee
right,
Stadium.
exactly, right. Like, I mean, that was specifically designed. What I hear And this is the difference. I think it's interesting. First of all, we can't have this conversation. And in the show, it's come up many times, but the Desserteau's concept of strategies and tactics. And I want to bring it up. But the problem is, of course, I have Professor Malaby in this room who's going to be very clear as I possibly mangle this. But the way that the layman's definition, the difference between strategy and tactic is there's often folks in positions of power, whether they're designing the city streets, as you kind of mentioned, or they're designing the walls of an outfield. They're designing the Green Monster in Boston for the way the team is designed. They're trying to specifically manage the actions of the people that will play, whether it's the people that are walking through a city or the people that are come up to bat in that baseball park. In the same way that Wizards of the Coast is trying to define the way that people will play with the game, in the same way that authors will write a book and the idea that this is how a reader should read a book. And then the concept, there's the tactical response to that. And that's the person on the street walking through the streets. That's the batter at the plate deciding how he's going to hit the ball, no matter how high the outfield wall is or where the foul ground has been designed. It's the same way over Gary Gygax saying, okay, I'm supposed to read this text and read it, and I'm supposed to give the publisher my $5 to read this Pulp Fiction book, but I want to do more. I'm now going to make a game about it. What I hear in all of that, and what I find interesting, this is the difference, I suppose, between anthropology and perhaps the humanities, is, and I always come back to this, it's amazing about how much constrictions or how the environments that we go through, whether it's a media environment, it's a baseball field, it's a city, whatever the design is, are not, I shouldn't say constrained, but are designed to modify our behaviors in a certain way. And how dynamic this, even loans, and I don't necessarily believe in lone subjectivity. I'm very much against individualism. I think that we're all kind of inevitable consequences of emerging from relationships, but that's
But
me
do you
digressing
believe
too
in
much.
truth?
I don't even believe in free will. Sorry, Rush. But the point I want to make is it's amazing how we navigate all of those things, right? It's amazing how many institutions, from game designers to ballpark designers to city designers, are constantly trying to modify our behavior. And yet the human element in all of those things is able to, when we come to bat, when we run a game as a dungeon master, when we sit down and play and have our D20s, and we're able to look as a player in a tabletop role-playing game, we're able to understand what the different probabilities of what to hit of a sword are, and are able to navigate through that to somewhat at least get as close to the outcome as we would like. I just find it so interesting that there's so much of an elusiveness and a creativity to the human subjectivity, despite all of the institutions trying to tell us where we can and can't move and place a ball, right? Does that make any sense?
So you just said you're optimistic.
I also think, these institutions are made by people, right? Which means it's interesting because people are full of agency, but they're also insanely fallible. This is why, conspiracy theories and, current political, I can never believe in a conspiracy element because I know how unbelievable people are. Just not, I don't want to use the term smart, but they're not.
I saw some stuff in the past 10 days. I agree.
Anyway, that was a little bit of a rant. I don't know if you want to.
I think you said a lot of really smart things there in a Dessertovian mode, right? So Desserteau has exactly that point of view on the relationship between institutions and how individuals subject to them moving through the spaces controlled by institutions. A very important idea for Desserteau.
Mm-hmm.
Those people are never, ever going to simply behave the way the institution is trying to prompt them to behave.
Yeah.
Now, that for Desserteau, that's a beautiful thing. He really wants to celebrate that. But the way I think is the notion I would layer on top of that, which I think is really helpful to think about, is institutions are only ever making bets.
Right.
They're expensive bets, right? When they lay out a city grid or build a corporate headquarters or design Skyrim or whatever it is, they are making bets about the behavior inside those spaces, right? Now, classically, when Desserteau is writing, even though there's this fascinating passage where he imagines things could be quite different in the future, and I have a piece about all of that, but when he's writing, he basically thinks of institutions as only having at their disposal bureaucratic tools to order, right? You build a supermarket. You lay out the supermarket. You've got rows, aisles 1 through 12, and that's where your customers are how they're supposed to shop. They go down aisle 1, up aisle 2, down aisle
Yeah.
3, but they don't, right? They don't do that, right?
Yeah.
They jump around,
Yep.
and that's beautiful for him. But when he's writing, this is before computing. This is before certainly computing at the scale we're talking about, the way it has reached into our daily lives and landed in our pockets. What happens now, I think, is that institutions have come to understand that, wait a second, what if we made the environment contingent and dynamic for the people who are moving through it?
Mm-hmm.
But they're not going to see the roles behind the scenes, the algorithms behind the scenes that lead their TikTok feed to have that particular character to it. They're going to take that to be, here's my favorite example of this. In the early days of the internet, if you went to the Google homepage, this is still true, I think, but it operates a little differently now. There was the search bar, famously Spartan search page, right? The search bar, and there were 2 buttons. One was search. What was the second button?
Feeling lucky.
I'm feeling lucky. And I'm feeling lucky is the oracle of performance in the digital age, because you click on, what happens if you clicked on that? Originally, it's not true anymore because they didn't want to give up the ad revenue, but originally you click on I'm feeling lucky and it takes you directly to the first search result. What does that say? It says some magical, enchanted even, relationship between your ability to come up with a string of words that you type into the search bar and Google's algorithm and all the social processes out there to create websites that they're crawling through have all aligned. You are in a state of grace. You are at one with the internet because you can type in a string of words and find exactly what you wanted. If you're feeling lucky, right? It says something about you. It says something about Google. It says something about that landscape of websites produced, right? That is the architecting of contingency, of indeterminacy, in a way that generates a really strong legitimacy claim for Google, because it's involving you in what makes that world sensible and real and trustable and coherent, right? So that, to me, the dystopian perspective is right, but things have changed because institutions have at their disposal not just the old ordering bureaucratic techniques of colonizing space and making their bets on their corporate, campus or whatever it was, and now can sort of in your pocket lead you to sort of feel like, hey, I'm dynamically surfing the algorithm in the universe, right? And it feels like it just emerges from you. It's what you want.
Ben, I know you want to say, I just want to say, and I have so much more I want to say, but I think you should probably have the floor at this point. But I do want to say something that I find really funny that hit me while you were talking about this guy. First, I'm going to zip it. I think it's interesting if we're talking about dystopian concepts around how we make a metaphor, especially to tabletop role-playing game. If we're going to talk about strategy and tactics, the metaphor of the dungeon master walking into any room and saying, I have an idea. I have made these amazing NPCs that the party is going to go. I've made my MacGuffin. I know exactly what the party is going to do. I have designed my architectural structure to make sure they go in this way. And then, of course, the players go in a completely different way. That's like the best, I think, TTRPG metaphor for exactly what they're talking about. Like no DM, just everything that a DM does is strategy before the sessions, and players are on the tactical level. But I also think it's interesting. And Ben, the reason I'm saying this before I hand it over to you, Ben, sorry, is it's interesting to me because isn't this what Wizards of the Coast is trying to do? Right? Aren't they trying to place their bets both on what the future technology is going to look like, but their bets on what players want out of D&D in the best way that they can monetize this? And with that, Ben, what are you going to say?
Dr. Malaby, you want to say anything to that, or else I'll ask a question?
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to think. I had something to say for the first part of what you were talking about, Scott, but then you hit with Wizards of the Coast, and I was like, oh, the DM. I think you're right. I think part of what's special. So I'm an anthropologist, so for me, the co-present, although I think it can happen even remotely, but like co-present humanity, where we are in the full bandwidth of encountering each other as human beings, with all of the stuff that I see is built into us as social creatures, right? Reveals the ways in which it is not always about contest. There was that weird moment in D&D for
Mm.
years where everybody was thinking it was like the DM against the players. And I always thought that was such a, I mean, and I grew up playing it at the beginning of the game, and I always thought that was such a strange way of like forcing onto D&D a particular modernist, individualist, contest-based notion of zero-sum game and the war of all against all. It's Hobbesian, right? But in fact, what you just described is exactly right. That happens. The players will do something completely different than what you predicted. And unlike an institution, which has expensively often made certain bets on things going a certain way, in a well-run D&D or TTRPG session generally, or probably any game actually, any game between people which is socially made by them together rather than something they're relying on an architecture produced for them, that all of that can happen. And it's something other than the metaphor, the pugilistic metaphor of everybody's fighting against everyone else. There are social theorists like Renato Rosaldo who said, why is contest our fundamental metaphor for how human beings relate to each other? He says,
Right.
what about dance? What if we imagined that the better fundamental metaphor for how we relate to each other is dance? Look at crowds moving on a sidewalk on a busy day in New York City. Everybody's moving and adjusting their bodies relative to each other so they don't run into each other. That's a beautiful dance that they're all doing, right? And that's what we're doing with strangers, right? Why are
Well,
we assuming there's this contest at the heart of it?
Yeah,
I'm
I
gonna
would
jump. I'm
say
gonna jump in front of you
yeah,
there, Scott. I'm gonna
go
jump in
for it,
front of you there
please.
because this is too perfect a moment. Have either of you ever been to Japan?
Our youngest child just spent 2 weeks there.
But you've never been yourself?
I have not been, unfortunately, no.
Did they say anything about walking on the sidewalks?
They talked about how clean Japan is.
So because Japan is a country where they drive opposite from us, so they're going on the left side of the road. Because of that, they also walk on the left side of the sidewalks. So when you get to Japan, I lived there for 2 years. My wife lived, sorry, I lived there for 1 year. My wife lived there for 3 years, and she's Canadian. But I got there and I'm walking around and I'm constantly running into people. Dodge, dodge, hit, hit, and there's bicycles coming at you. So when you mention the dance and the New York sidewalk as a metaphor for humanity, that immediately jumped out at me was that experience in Japan of like, oh wow, there are all sorts of unspoken rules about how you're moving around here. But
Right, right. We are more human than we know, than we tend to remember. We are more social as human beings than we tend to remember.
so let me ask you this question, because again, we also have a lot of game designers who listen.
Yeah.
If you were going to take your knowledge of uncertainty and games and try and put it into some sort of a actionable piece of advice for a beginning tabletop role-playing game designer, what might you say, or do you reject the premise of the question?
Well, so I have a lot of experience with this actually. I mean, back in the day, I was early in my academic career as a young professor. I was writing on a blog called Terra Nova. And Terra Nova was a blog where a lot of both academics and game designers came together to talk together about virtual worlds. Virtual worlds are the latest big thing at the time. That's Second Life, it's World of Warcraft, EverQuest, all of these different places. Julian DeBell, who wrote a wonderful book about Lambda Mu. A good friend of mine was an author, Ted Castronova, a bunch of other people. T.L. Taylor, who everybody listening to this podcast just needs to know about because everything she's written is beautiful and wonderful. But there were a number of different game designers on there. Richard Bartle, the wonderful Richard Bartle. I saw him when I was in England a few years ago. He's wonderful. Several, and one of them was a gentleman by the name of Bob Moore. There's also Randy Farmer, by the way. That's a whole other discussion. Randy Farmer was brilliant. Habbo Hotel, I believe it was Randy Farmer, just amazing guy. But it was Bob Moore. I had posted, Scott generously mentioned my piece Beyond Play, which I wrote in those years and did a blog post about it. I think when it came out when I posted it as a working paper somewhere, and I was so flattered because Bob goes and reads it as a game designer. He says, yeah, that's pretty much how I think about designing games. And in the piece, I do actually lay out, I say, there are different kinds of constraints and there are different kinds of contingencies. And what the game designer is trying to do, this is the art of it, is to calibrate those against each other in a way that the performative input of the player has just the right mix of pattern and unpredictability, right? There's a wonderful piece that actually would be better than reading my stuff. I think would be.
Don't be humble here, Professor. Plug yourself.
There's a incredible article, not really talked about nearly as much as it should be, called An Exploratory Model of Play. And it's by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, people who know below, Csikszentmihalyi, co-authored it with an anthropologist named H. Stith Bennett in American Anthropologist in like 1971. And they saw it. They saw what almost nobody else was seeing, which is that we only get interested in playing a game when it is neither so patterned and predictable that we know what's going to happen, nor so unpredictable that it's like static. We just sort of like get anxious and frustrated. And that's really the magic of it, is right there. And I think, I suppose I take Bob Moore's comment on my piece to say, yeah, my framework for saying here are the different kinds of contingency and here are the different kinds of constraints, that could be helpful for organizing the thinking, right, of a designer who's setting about to play games or to design games. There is, if you really wanted to get heady about it, there's a chapter by a famous philosopher named Alistair McIntyre who talks about these kinds of contingency. I read it after I sort of was thinking of them, but he basically lays them all out, right? Game theoretic contingency, my guess about your point of view, is not the same thing as making a shot in basketball, and that's not the same thing as the weather at a horse race track. Like, they are all different kinds of unpredictability. And I think when game designers know that, I'm not one, but I might guess you are, Ben.
I'm a historian, but that's okay.
That they might feel like they are better equipped, right, to think about the choices they're making when they're designing their environment.
Can I jump on a little?
Scott,
this conversation is fantastic. I mean, just anytime I have to grab my notes and be like, oh, I want to say some things, I think it's always a product of it. It's interesting. I mean, as soon as you bring up Richard Bartle, and who's one of my favorite authors, and he wrote the book called Designing Virtual Worlds, you just got kind of my head spinning around a lot of the topics that we've already kind of covered. But it's interesting to me, the Richard Bartle so he wrote a book that is enormous, called Designing Virtual Worlds, and me and I think Professor Chris Przicki up in Green Bay, if anybody can look him up, are probably the only two people. I don't know if you've ever read the thing like cover to cover, because it's so fascinating, because it deals with a lot of the questions, and it's about design. It's about, so Richard Bartle comes from, he's one of the designers of some of the first multi-user dungeons. What does MOO stand for? Multi-online?
It's a multi-user dungeon, object-oriented.
Thank you.
We created MUD 1 in the 70s on the mainframes at the British universities, back then. It was the first text-based. It would read to us like Adventure, the first text-based.
Which is what, yeah.
But it was multi-user, so it was like a multi-user version of that.
Yeah, a lot of listeners know that, when I originally had come to this entire field from kind of interactive fiction. We've talked about infogam games in the past on this thing as well. So they basically, for those who don't know, my guess is our listeners probably know more than I do about multi-user dungeons, but they're very much around those old text adventures, but made for multiple users at a time. It's like World of Warcraft, but all you have is, text to say what direction you're going to go from. But it's interesting that you mentioned him, because one of the things that I'm thinking about as we're talking is the difference between, so one of the things that we've kind of peripherally mentioned is that Wizards of the Coast seems to have a vested monetary interest in moving folks over to the digital side. And one of the things that struck me earlier we were talking about is this concept of, like, how can we move people to algorithms that might be more algorithms or contingencies or probabilities, or ways that might be more structures and architecture that might be more easily controlled or less dynamic. If we sit down at a tabletop role-playing game, we are sitting down with only people. The rules, the session, the social situation is in constant negotiation. We're going to be talking to people. Everything is under negotiation. Whether the people stay has to be negotiated based on how the people are feeling about one another. While Wizards of the Coast can move people to, whether it's D&D Beyond or making sure that people are, I shouldn't say virtual tabletop, because even then folks are still generally in a social situation.
But no, you're right. I can tell you even why the virtual tabletop it would come under the microscope from your perspective, for sure, right? So if you don't mind my jumping in, right?
Yeah.
So
Please.
in the digitally natural piece, which I mentioned before, this is a really important issue for me, right? I mentioned how the advent of code and digital network technologies make it possible to put behind the scenes a lot of architecting of contingency, right? That previously was,
Yeah.
you see the dice rolling in front of you, or whatever, right? So of course, behind a lot of the push for something like D&D Beyond or VTT, at the end of the day, I mean, I haven't looked into the issue closely, but I've studied tech companies, is the subscription model, right? There's no more reliable source of revenue and capital. Wonderful, right? So that's what they want, in a sense. But imagine the following. Imagine what is lost, right? In a way that people might not notice because they would take it to be natural or even kind of value added in a virtual tabletop sense, right? Okay, you are playing a virtual tabletop with 4 friends, right? And I've seen only some of the early beta of this from what they're, but I imagine it'd be something like what they showed, right? And compare what it's like to play that around a table, or even like this, where everybody's just making use of remote technologies, just put their faces in front of each other, right? Compare the difference between that and the virtual tabletop when the wizard casts the fireball into the room that's filled with all the alchemical equipment, and the party is there, and there's the monsters, and this is that, right? And it is up to that table, up to that group of people, it's a social project now to produce a sense of that event in description. Maybe somebody stands up and acts something out, the looks on people's faces, gestures, moves, all these things, the concatenation of one person's description into another person's description. Oh yeah, and then that means this would happen and that would happen, and I'm diving behind this. And imagine the difference between that as a contingent event, right? I would layer in something I haven't talked about here. The fancy word is semiotic contingency, but it's basically the way in which meaning itself is always a little indeterminate. We're always making language as we go along, every moment to every moment, right? So in that moment, when somebody describes a fireball doing this and everybody talks about what happens, they are yet again amplifying and embroidering the idea of what a fireball is, right? Because it is not a Platonic concept. That is so different from a virtual tabletop that says, all right, this is the room, this is the alchemical lab that you're in, and you're fighting these monsters, and the wizard throws a fireball, and now we all see what
You've just completely convinced me to never use a map again, by the way.
happens.
I mean, that's such an interesting, as you know, I run two long running games. One, obviously, this in person. One, and I'm constantly being reminded of what digital environments can and can't do. But I think that's the one thing I like about computers is that for the first time, I actually think in some ways they're illustrating what is, I would say, unique about human subjectivity around sitting here and like, I don't know. It's interesting to me. I don't necessarily know where I'm going with that, but it is. But I mean, the game is always completely. It comes back to the concept of like the ballpark. The game is always going to be context sensitive, and it's not just context sensitive onto to the subjectivities around the table, but it's also going to be context sensitive to how long it takes the pizza to get there, to the lighting in the room itself are all going to. It's strange because the non-diegetic and the diegetic game that's going on, things that are happening in the game are constantly being modified by if a player sits down and they're having a bad day, their ranger, who has no idea of who their player is controlling them, might actually make different actions in that moment, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. My head is swirling different dimensions around how. One of the questions that I'd wanted to ask you when we were knew that we were gonna have you on the show is whether you thought as an anthropologist. I guess I'm gonna use that as my segue to my question, which is I'm always I think you and I actually we always resist exceptionalism, which is people are always talking about computers programs do things that other things can't do, and that's also the tabletop role playing game community is guilty of that as well, as saying that tabletop role playing games are like no other game that's ever been invented, despite the fact that all to me it is a codification of the practices. It's turning a game of what had often routinely been play in the past, right? The only thing that I think is revelatory about tabletop role-playing game is it is okay as a social practice to play make-believe with other adults. That to me is the only revelatory thing. And now I led with what I think. And my question to you is, what do you think from an anthropological perspective is interesting about the practice of tabletop role-playing game as opposed to other games, digital or other analog games?
Yeah, I haven't made it my business to sort of ferret out those kinds of um, historical, I guess, questions, but I haven't. I'm going to give you an answer, but I just
Yep.
want to lead with that. I do think there's always a bit of a danger there's a temptation, right, in wanting to think in terms of absolutes in a way. Who was first? Superlatives, right?
Right.
What
Yep.
makes this different? So, with the pragmatic kind of qualifications out of the way, right? I don't believe in any of these absolute distinctions. And before I answer, I also want to just give a shout out because you almost perfectly replicated my favorite quote from the great Randy Farmer, F. Randall Farmer, who I mentioned before at Terra Nova. Context is king. That was his favorite thing to say. As a game designer, context is king. But what makes TTRPGs? What would a really good history of human games hang on TTRPGs as important, right? Because human games are not what they were, right? There are differences in developments and complexities, right? And I guess the one, and I'm sure someone could contradict me, but the one I would think of is the removal of end conditions. To me, that's the most interesting thing
Huh.
that TTRPGs do. And maybe somebody will tell me, a listener on this podcast may chime in with something that I'm not aware of, right? But the idea that a world is produced where the performative actions of its participants, its players, have durable consequences, not just durable for this game session, but they linger. You leave, and then you come back. I'm not even talking about World of Warcraft. That's persistent virtual worlds. That's like the next level of this, right? Those kinds of places. I'm talking about Dave Arneson's D&D game near the Twin Cities, right?
Mm-hmm.
That they played 2 weeks ago. They didn't get to play last week, and now they're going to play this week. And the game, there's no end condition. Nobody's looking for the game. You can't win D&D. That is remarkable. And that is a distinctive step toward using these mechanisms of constraints and contingencies to fuel the production of something that feels like the texture of everyday life. Right? Games have always, I would say, they've always involved the same categories of constraints and the same categories of unpredictability that we encounter in our daily lives. We encounter stochastic contingency, the randomness of weather or other things. We encounter the fact that we may succeed or fail on something we try to do. We encounter the fact that we can't really guess other people's point of view except poorly. We encounter all those things. We encounter the architectural constraints and the rules and conventions. That's always true in games, but when games no longer have an end condition, it makes it much easier for the producers and designers of games to make those games look and feel more like everyday life, even when they're not digital yet, even when they have to rely on those vulgar mechanisms, whether it's the dice or the character sheets or the stat blocks or whatever it is. They still have taken a gigantic leap beyond games that have end conditions. Now it's a world that we're producing. It's not an event.
I love that concept that it's a world that we're reproducing, not necessarily an event. I think, I mentioned this in my dissertation a little bit, but it's interesting to me because I have a long-running game, and I ran that game. When I initially started that game, I said, this game will last as long as I do. So it's interesting to me that the world of AppShy so that it's by Campaign World, and it's specifically designed to host many systems. But it does have an end condition, which is my own mortality, except that, as I wrote in my dissertation, I would love to be able to hand that world over to my children, who, of course, are going to be like, gee, D&D is geeky. I'm not playing that, Dad. At some point, I'm sure that's literally how they're going to talk in 10 years. I don't know. That's fascinating. Ben, thoughts?
So I will challenge you on something absolutist. And I think this is Robin Laws who originated this idea that D&D is in fact a new medium because it unifies the writer, actor, and audience in one person.
Writer, actor, and audience. Who is the one person?
So if you sit down to play a game of D&D and you are Bob the Ranger, you are both Bob's writer, you are the person portraying Bob, and you're also the audience enjoying that performance at the same time. And that there's no other medium that does all of those things at once.
I appreciate the insight of that, Ben, but I hate to make this kind of move.
No, this is exactly why I'm bringing it up. I want to. It wasn't even my idea, so crap all over it.
All right, I'm sorry. Okay, you gave me permission, but it's parochial to modernism to say that. It's parochial to the notion of an author and an audience and a writer to say that. Because human societies, for the vast majority of our history, have not had writers and audiences.
Yeah.
And it has not, and performers. It has not. It has had people producing life together, for one thing, but also imaginative worlds together, right? Storytelling is there's one of the things I work super hard at with our graduate students is to try and shake them from the habits of thinking that are super modern individualist, right? So we tend to think about, well, there must be somebody, that's the triumphant modern individual, who has the agency in a given moment to be the person telling the story, like the Homeric, teller of tales, the epic poet. But in fact, for most human societies, the production of meaning together is a together phenomenon already. It was already everybody is. There's an incredible piece by Clifford Geertz, probably the world's most famous anthropologist. His piece about a game is not very good, I would say, Deep Play. But it was a very famous piece by him. But his piece called what is it? I'm blanking on it, but it's a religious interpretation of the world or something like that. It'll come to me later. In the latter part of it, he tells you this. He gives this incredible description of this theater performance in Bali, where it's the telling of this epic tale of this demon witch and this mythical bestial figure. I can remember the names. I'm about to teach it this fall. I should remember it. I've taught it 12 times. Barung and the witch. And this performance, of course, from modern audience eyes, we tend to think, okay, well, there's going to be an audience and there's going to be a performance and there are the actors and they're all doing this. But no, it is a production of the world of the sacred and the profane in which the Balinese live. And as such, commonly, when it is performed, the audience is taken up by it and rush the stage and change the outcome, or try to affect the outcome. It is not at all. It's a bit like, kabuki. I don't know a lot about kabuki, but it has a similar quality of involvement and engagement on the part of the audience, right? So my reaction to that kind of reasoning only is to say, let's not congratulate ourselves too much on breaking the boundaries between the audience, the performer, and the author, because that's actually typically true for a lot of societies for most of human history. That's apologies, but that's my perspective.
That's good. I mean, like, again, I love hearing differing. I'll admit, as a modernist, I think that you're still talking about, like, they're the audience in Bali is still the audience, right? Like it's still.
Nope.
So it's the audience that's putting on the play
as much as anybody else, right? Our categories of audience, performer, author, we take to be natural, rigid, platonic, grounded, absolute, and they should be applied everywhere. And that starts to drive the kind of academics that go out and find the answer they expect wherever they look.
I mean, I have just thrown amen onto that, right? I mean, we're talking about, very much modernist principles. So categorization, quantifications of systems in many ways is, to me, imposition of meaning, or it's the imposition of a narrative onto things that are generally fairly modern. That's why I think, to me, like, the concept of tabletop role-playing game is new and revelatory is not necessarily true, is because we're literally doing this exact same practice probably like 300 years ago. We just didn't necessarily have a name for it. Now, names are extremely important. Once you can put a name to something, and certainly in modern society, once you can not only put a name to it, but also put a price tag to it, that's something new. But we've been doing a lot of these practices before. What I think is interesting is when they become socially acceptable or capitally acceptable, I would say.
Well,
if that makes any sense.
To return us to the Graeber, right? Like, I would say one of the things that's different that he notices is the access to these mechanisms, these rationalized mechanisms for the production of both rules and architectural constraints, but also especially contingencies of different kinds. We've always had dice, there some of the oldest archaeological objects are things that produce stochastic outcomes, right? But there is something different from storytelling, collective storytelling, to TTRPGs, right? And I think that has something to do with the bureaucratization that Graeber is very interested in. It has something to do with the idea of rules, the idea of not just rules in the original sense of constraining behavior, but generative rules which are supposed to create the conditions for people to do surprising things along with the stochastic elements, right? So the rules that make room for performative contingencies, but also make room for the stochastic die rolls that fill D&D and the other types of indeterminacies, those are different, I think, right? I mean, I could always be proven wrong, but I don't, it's hard for me not to, like, I agree with you, Scott, right? Like the stuff that is common to being human is the participatory element of us producing things together with our imaginations socially, right? Without without retreating to distinctions like audience or author and the rest, right? And to see that deeper human participation and social action going on without those anything that is blinders that might be created by those words. But I do think that TTRPGs in this era have something that you can't really find in before the 20th century, which is all of these things that Max Weber talked about, which is, codification and rationalization, and then layered on top of that, the better and better ways in which you fold the rulemaking in with ways of producing uncertain outcomes, right? So that they can together produce this durable world that doesn't quite feel like just telling a story.
That's interesting. Yeah.
All right, Professor, can you tell us about your upcoming event?
Sure. So this is again, for the Royal Anthropological Institute. There is apparently a burgeoning network of anthropologists in Europe interested in playing games that a very wonderful, energetic PhD student named Kellen Wee has been sort of getting together. And the Royal Anthropological Institute noticed how vibrant this community was and approached her and said, well, I think we should do a series about this. So she asked her network, who do you want to hear from? And I think apparently they want to hear from me. So there's going to be a series this year of these 2-hour Zoom virtual presentations that are open to anyone. Anyone can register via the link on the Royal Anthropological Institute website. I believe
and we will have that link in the show notes for sure.
Right. It's therai.org, but yeah, we'll provide the link. And it will be an occasion where I will actually, I've got a lot of time. Which isn't always the case for professors. So I'm going to do several things. One thing I'm going to do is look back at the project of modernism, actually, and its relationship to indeterminacy.
That sounds strangely relevant to our discussion.
That's right. Well, when you think about it, until the rise of modernity, and I now you'll understand that I don't see nothing to the concept of modernity, but until the rise of modernity, there was especially when it came to political authority, economics, and intellectual inquiry, there wasn't a lot of room for creative, playful experimentation. There wasn't a lot of room for legitimate, indeterminate outcomes. So one of the things I'll be talking about is the way in which I'll be pointing at least toward the way in which democracy as a political form is game-like, and it's kind of the way modernism is trying to solve the problem of no longer having kings, is to say, well, come up with a system that's legitimately indeterminate. Before then, maybe the project of the Western Academy and the Royal Society perhaps starts it in England is, well, the project of academic inquiry is legitimately indeterminate. And then you think about someone like Adam Smith, who's noticing and telling the mercantilists of England to stop trying to control the economy from the top down because there's a legitimate indeterminacy in the invisible hand of how the market works. So I'll be looking back about the relationship, back at the relationship between institutions and indeterminacy, then looking at the most interesting current work. But then I'm going to be looking ahead to things like AI and other digital technologies and the things we need to be aware of about the architecting of indeterminacy to engage our attention in modern life.
I want to briefly shout out our new Patreon subscriber, Joe Christensen. And Scott, would you be so kind as to tell us about our Patreon?
I will do that. But I still have 2 questions left for
Okay.
Professor Malaby.
Then go ahead and do it now.
But since we can't, we should mention the Patreon as often as possible. I would like to buy some new clothes. So for those of you out there, would like to make sure that I have something when the school year starts. The Patreon is up. If you do join the Patreon, you do get access to our Discord, where we will be more than happy to talk about all of the questions, all of the amazing stuff that we have chatted about tonight. And also gives you, again, if you join, even we are going to be having a hard launch in geez, about 4 weeks from now. But if you get in earlier, you'll also have access to a lot of Ben Riggs. You just got back from Gen Con. My gosh, we have to have an entire episode around that. But all of the seminars that Ben has been doing, and then when Ben and I do a live show together, that gives you access to those things. So I would very much recommend that for only $3 a month, which is like 1D4 a month, you have access to those things. And again, the ongoing discussion, the discourse on Discord as well. I thought it was so interesting that you brought up modernity. I made this comment that it's interesting to me to think about theories are very much like Dungeons and Dragons rule systems. Like the way that we look at the world is very much like the way that first edition, or second edition, or third edition tries to make the bureaucratic algorithms to produce a world. But before we let Professor Malaby go, I just realized that I think we should always ask these of all of our guests, which is, I have 2 quick questions of you, which is, why do you play Dungeons and Dragons? And because I know your character, who is Benton, who is a halfling rogue in the Curse of Strahd game, why did you choose that character?
Yeah, well, the answers to both of those questions probably actually go together. My very first character in D&D was a halfling rogue. I had not played one since. And I suppose it was maybe because all of our conversations, Scott, there was a sense of a kind of kindred spirit about D&D and what D&D is. But it's not only that. It's also because most of my adult life playing D&D has been on behalf of my children, where I'm either DMing or maybe I've got a kind of a in the background DMPC because none of them want to wade into combat, so we need a tank apparently, that kind of thing. So I finally got a chance to sort of play my own character and not be a DM, so that was it. But I love playing rogues. So why do I love playing rogues? I think they're for this very much the same reasons we've been talking about tonight. Systems, bureaucratized systems tend to invite strategic thinking, like you mentioned with Disserto. And to me, the strategists, as opposed to the tacticians amongst the classes in D&D, are the wizards, right? The wizards have a hammer for every kind of nail, right? They have fireball for every situation.
Sure.
Context is not king for them. I mean, obviously they have to deal with questions of context, but we all know the expression, right? There's no situation that isn't improved by throwing a well-placed fireball, right? You have to place it well, but that's not the same thing to me as tactical play, which engages context, right? So the idea of playing a rogue or battle master fighters in this edition of D&D or those kinds of classes, which it is that's a class where as a player you end up asking the DM, is there a chandelier in this room? Is it a rope? Is it held by a rope? Is it tied to the wall? I love that stuff. I love the tactical part of it, which is part of the reason, by the way, I'd make a special plea for maps, even if they be simple. But so I started playing D&D though because I have 2 older brothers. I was the youngest, and the middle brother in my family was everything to me. I was the Moonglum to his Elric. For those of who Moorcock series, Elric Melnibone, whatever. And I was attached to him at the hip, and he was playing D&D, and I was playing with him with a wonderful DM in Rochester, Minnesota in 1978, named Greg Benson. And that was at the public library. And that was it. As a nerdy kid who had a very active imagination and life of the mind and read everything and read Tolkien and all the rest, this was the end all be all for me. But on top of that, my father was an engineer for IBM. and loved games. My grandfather was probably the best pool player in Ohio. And when the National Touring Pros traveled the U.S., they played against my father. During the Depression, there was a doctor who would drive down from Cleveland to play my grandfather every Sunday with $10 on the table, which was a gigantic amount of money in the Depression, just to try and beat my grandfather, and he never beat him. And those $10 paid for a lot of meals for my aunts and uncles. So my grandfather and my father, we played cards. My grandfather was an incredible pinochle player. We connected to each other as a family over games. We had a pool table in the basement. We played cards. So D&D was to me just an extension of that. And then I had early computers because my dad worked for IBM. So I was playing spelling games. Is why I can type incredibly fast, is because the only game we had on my early computer was a typing game. And then from then on, so games and computing from early.
Nice. Well, then, Professor Malaby, I just want to thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been wonderful. Scott, you want to say anything else?
No, join the Discord. What a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for Professor Malaby. And this is one of those conversations where there's like, I have 3 more hours of like notes that I just want to continue talking about. And thankfully, at least I get to play with you every other week, which is fantastic. So we can continue these conversations. But I mean, I am going to say one last thing, which I just think that it's fascinating, this concept of like how much these worlds matter to us. You know, it doesn't matter how much we think about them or how little we think about it, how much we feel about them or how little we feel about them, how much they matter to all of us. And how much the social practice of this thing is so much basically a practice of kind of reaching out to other folks and forming these kind of strange worlds that mean not so much to ourselves, but also to one another. And I just think this, in many ways, this kind of conversation illuminates that. So I just want to say thank you very much for coming on, Professor Malaby. Again, Ben, thanks so much for running these conversations. They're brilliant.
My pleasure. With that, I'm Ben Riggs.
I'm Scott Bruner.
And we'll have you all have a good week. See you later. Thanks so much, Professor.
Thank you.
Good night. Bye-bye.